I heard a painter and decorator chatting the other day. And he was a painter and decorator who worked for a local council. And his job was, whenever there was a time between tenants, he would go into the council house and he would paint pretty much everything. Every day, same job. And every day, same colour. Anyone guess what colour? Magnolia. Every day, same job. Every day, same colour. Just lost in the monotony of magnolia. And this is what he said. Amid all that magnolia, there must be more to life than this. I guarantee you, there are loads of folk in our community who are in that headspace. Stuck in that same emptiness where life is just magnolia. And I'll tell you what's real, is that when you're in that headspace, the colour magnolia turns very dark very quickly. I've met with 2 young men from our community this week who in the darkness of depression have either tried or thought about self-harm and suicide. It is too easy and it is too common for us to get into that dark headspace. And maybe that's you this morning. And if it is, I beg you, lean in and listen well, because God has something for you this morning. He's got light for that darkness. He's going to have life for that deadness. He's actually got a burst of multicolour for all that magnolia. But before he gets us there, it's interesting. He's going to join you in that dark headspace, and he's going to take the rest of us into it. At the start and the end of the passage we read, the Apostle Paul takes us into a deadly headspace that's full of ifs. I don't know about you, but when I'm lying on my bed at night, it's the word if that takes me into that really dark headspace. What if this happens? Or what if that person does this? Or what if that happens to this person? Or what if my kids? Or what if they find out? What if? You been there? It's the what ifs that can make life really dark and oppressive. And that's where Paul goes. Both ends of the passage. Have a look at verse 12 if you've got a Bible. In verse 12 it starts with Paul saying, but if. But look how many times it comes up. Verse 13. Another if. Verse 14. And if. Verse 16. For if. Verse 17. And if. Verse 19. If only. And then if you go down to verse 29, the other end of the passage. Now if. Again in verse 29. If. Again in 32. If. That's a lot of ifs. But it is that dark, deadening headspace where you are thinking worst case scenario. What if? It's the first kind of half of what I want us to see today, or the two kind of outside edges of this passage, is that the Apostle Paul, he takes us into a deadly headspace of futility. That's where we're going to go. Now, the ifs that he's talking about is the if that says, what if there is nothing beyond this world? It seems there was people in the church in Corinth who were denying the fact that there was going to be a resurrection from the dead. Now, seemingly they had no problem believing that this guy Jesus could raise from the dead. They had a kind of place in their head for a mythical superhero who could rise. But when it came to your average punter like me or you, they were saying, there's no rising, there's just dying. That's all there is. Me and Josh read this, I think it was Tuesday, trying to get our heads into this text for today. And the first thing he noticed was, man, the word dead comes up a lot in this text. Was it 16 times, something like that? And the duplication of that word dead is deafening, or deadening in some ways. And to use Paul's words, he takes us into this headspace. If you look at verse 19, where he says, if only for this life we have hope. It's as if there's a ceiling that's above our heads that says, There's nothing beyond this world, only for this life. You see it again in verse 32. He uses the phrase, no more than human hopes. So many people live, and that's the ceiling. There's only this life. There's no more than human hope. And in that place, the ceiling of death becomes like blackout blinds that block out any light. And it becomes the kind of coffin lid that blocks out any life. And it becomes like that charter from the council that denies any burst of colour. That's the ceiling. Only this life, no more than human hopes. He says, listen, if the resurrection of Jesus from the dead doesn't give us a resurrection from the dead, then he isn't a superhero. He's just a myth. Forget about him. If Jesus didn't rise, then we just all die. And if death wins, then we all lose. It's a pretty dark headspace, isn't it? Everything, Paul says, rests on the resurrection of Jesus. And if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, all that we're doing here as a church, all that we're trying to be to each other, if Jesus didn't rise, the whole thing falls like a house of cards. We're done. If Jesus is still dead, we are done. We've got nothing. What are you left with? A ceiling of only this life, no more than human hopes. That's what Paul says. See if you track through the passage. He says, if that's the case, if Jesus is dead, verse 14, preaching like this, the word he uses is useless. He says, your faith, verse 14, useless. The apostles, verse 15, are liars. Your faith, verse 17, is futile. Your sins, verse 17, are still unforgiven. Loved ones who've died, some of us in the room, very recently bereaved. He says, if this is the case, verse 18, they are just lost. He says, verse 19, Christians, therefore, above all people, should be pitied. And he says in verse 30 and 32 that suffering is pointless. If all we're left with is this life, if we've got no more than human hopes, then everything falls down like a house of cards into a big pile of futility. That word futility is a weird word. Because on the one hand, it's that feeling where everything's empty. But on the other hand, it's that feeling that's very heavy. It's this kind of empty heaviness. You ever felt that? It's wearying, but I think it's everywhere. It looks different. You've got young lads in our community who will go literally from class barber for a skin fade, tans for a fake tan, the gym to get bulked, and they're chasing something. You've then got people who go from the chemist to the crack den because they are chasing something. You've got young lads who leave school and start running drugs because they're chasing something. You've got people who go from university classes to career ladders because they are chasing something. You've got people who go from relationship to relationship to relationship because they are chasing something. You've got people who go from doctor to tarot card reader to off license because they are chasing something. And you know what? They all look different, but the reality is they are all chasing the same feeling, but they're all limited by that same ceiling. Only this life, no more than human hopes, where death makes the chase futile. Heavy but empty. An empty heaviness with this overwhelming nightmare in the darkness of your head. What if this life is all there is? And you're in the painter's headspace, aren't you? Every day. Every wall, every ceiling. The monotony of Magnolia. Maybe that's where you are right now. Well, it's good that you are here right now. Because what you're going to see is, although that's at the either end of the passage, all these what ifs and these what ifs, in the middle of darkness and darkness, Paul puts light. And in the middle of death and death, Paul puts life. And in the middle of magnolia and magnolia, he puts this burst of multicolour. That's what I want to show you. I want to show you that he takes us into this deadening headspace of futility because he wants to show you the life-giving first fruits of Jesus' resurrection. If you just want two words for what we're doing today, we're doing futility to first fruits. That's where we're going. Have a look at verse 20. Verse 20 says, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead." Now, notice, there's no if there. We've gone from if to indeed. We're no longer in the kind of headspace of hypotheticals, of ifs and fantasies and fairy stories. We're in remember last week, the solid foundation of the Scriptures. We're in the hundreds of eyewitness testimonies about Jesus. Verse 20, "But Christ indeed has been raised from the dead." Mind that ceiling, no more than human hopes, only for this life. This is the event that bursts the ceiling off that headspace. There was a man who died and yet rose. There was a one who fought with death and won. Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. And notice, we'll read the rest of verse 20 and look out for the cheeky word that shows he didn't just do that for himself. He actually did it for you and me. Verse 20. "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." Now, first fruits is a farming thing. We're probably not that up to date with farming stuff because as close to farming as we get, it's like farm foods. But that misses out quite a big part of the process. The idea of first fruits was that it was the kind of, oh look, the excitement of the harvest has come. But it was more than that. It's more than the harvest has come. It was the promise and pledge that there was more to come. First fruits promised more fruit. Now, what's Paul saying? The resurrection of Jesus wasn't just a one-off thing. It was the first of lots of things. It was the first fruits of more fruit. And so what I want to do, I know some of us hear fruit and we instantly like that. But I'm actually going to show you there's two beautiful varieties of fruit that come from the first fruits of Jesus' resurrection. Jesus beating death was just first fruits that guaranteed more fruit. And I'm going to show you two kind of varieties of that fruit. The first is that he is the life giver. The second is that he is the death destroyer. All right? First then, the resurrection of Jesus is the first fruit that promises the more fruit of giving life. Now, to do that, Paul compares Adam with Jesus. I don't know if you remember that from verses 21 and 22. He uses Adam as a picture. He says, when Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, again, that wasn't just a one-off thing. That had an impact on lots of things. He says, in Adam, all died. Imagine it like dominoes. You ever watch those like videos on YouTube of like 10-minute dominoes falling? You seen them? That's the impact of Adam's sin. As Adam fell, every single person since Adam has fallen like dominoes. You can watch the history of humanity like a long YouTube video of dominoes falling. We like to think that we have evolved beyond the previous generation. We've learned from their weaknesses and we're not limited by their same limitations. But you know the truth of the matter is, we live life making the same mistakes that the previous generations have made, and we are limited by the same weaknesses that they inhabited. In Adam, all sin, and in Adam, all die. We're fallen. But, and this is where it starts to get exciting, just like if you remove the resurrection of Jesus and say it didn't happen, the whole of this falls. And just like in Adam, all of humanity have fallen. Here's what Paul's saying about Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead means that where everything else has fallen, you can take your stand. Now, I use that word deliberately because if you were here last week, you might remember that Kenny talked about that word. Chapter 15, verse 1. The resurrection of Jesus amid a world that is falling can empower you to stand firm. Because Jesus died for our sins, and because he saves us by raising from the dead, although in Adam you fall, Jesus can enable you to stand firm. You can defy the domino effect. Although in Adam you died, in Christ, and notice it doesn't say you have been, he says you will be made alive. Remember he's talking about first fruits. The resurrection of Jesus, the first fruits, it's the promise of more fruit. One day we'll all die like Jesus died. But the promise is if you belong to him, that's the language of verse 23, you will be made alive like him. Now I think we get this wrong. I think we often think the hope that Jesus brings us is that one day he will take our soul to some airy-fairy heaven. The hope here is better than that. The hope here is that Jesus' resurrection from the dead brings a physical resurrection from the dead because of his first fruits resurrection. Remember, first fruits is a promise of more fruit. Jesus doesn't just give spiritual life to our souls. His resurrection is the promise that he will bring physical resurrection to your body. When he comes again, there'll be a harvest of resurrected bodies, where he breathes life into our decomposed bodies and breathes life into our cremated ashes. What an amazing thing to think. The day that Jesus returns, cemeteries that are full of coffins will become fields bursting with fruit. Urns that have contained ashes will become vases bursting with life. New bodies given for his new creation. Let's think about this. When you look back to the resurrection of Jesus, I think we're tempted to look back as finished fact. Wrong. First fruits. The first fruits of more fruit. You don't just look back to Jesus' resurrection, you look forward because of Jesus' resurrection. He will bring physical life to your physical body. That's what you've got to look forward to. Now, there's a couple of important implications at this point. Number one, what you do with your body matters. Don't believe the lie that what you do with your body is irrelevant. Jesus rose from the dead to give life to your physical body. That's why Paul says earlier on in this letter, honor God with your body. The second implication is, it's okay to be discontent with the decay of your physical body. Some of us are struggling with illness or aging. The fact that Jesus rose to give hope to your physical body means it's okay to be sad about its decay, and it is right to long for its renewal. This is a steadfast hope of more fruit because of his first fruits. You get it? He is the life giver. But there's more than that. Remember I said there's two varieties of this fruit. Jesus' resurrection is the first fruit. The first variety is he gives life. The second one is There's a brutality to it, but there's a beauty to it. He is the life giver. He is also the death destroyer. When Paul says that Jesus is going to come again, it does signal the beginning of resurrection life for those who belong to him. But it also signals an end. The end for everything that has been against him. See, one of the ways that Jesus gives life to his people is not just by giving them life, but by protecting them from everything that would threaten their life. Look at verse 24. What does Jesus say he will destroy? All threatening dominions are destroyed. All threatening authority is destroyed. All threatening power is destroyed. Verse 25. All enemies will be placed under his feet. And in verse 26, death itself, the last enemy, destroyed. He gives life, and he destroys anything that would threaten your life. Now, I reckon one of the reasons that we can get into a really dark headspace is because it feels like the things that are standing against us will never end. Jesus' resurrection and the more fruit of his first fruits is that everything that is against you will come to an end. So, bullies, bitterness, bereavements, destroyed. Divorces, doubts, domestics, destroyed. Pedophiles, predator, pain, destroyed. Earthquakes and evil and envy, destroyed. Murder and migraines and misunderstandings, destroyed. Drugs and drunkenness and dementia, destroyed. Cancer and court cases and corruption, destroyed. Rape and racism and resentments, destroyed. Invasions and illnesses, destroyed. Abuse and addiction and anxieties, destroyed. Knife crime and nightmares and nerves, destroyed. Gangs and grenades and gossip, destroyed. Violence and viruses and vendettas, destroyed. Hankies and hospitals and hearses, destroyed. Satan and suffering and sin, destroyed. Depression and darkness and death, destroyed. Jesus' resurrection, it is not just past reality. It is the first fruits of more fruit that says he will reign until every enemy that could or would harm you destroyed. In a world marred by the monotony of magnolia, what a burst of colour, isn't it? The resurrection of Jesus is the one thing that says we are not limited to this life. We are not living beneath a ceiling of only human hopes. Into the dark headspace of futility, Paul says the resurrection of Jesus shines the life-giving firstfruits of Jesus' resurrection. Now, it's interesting. If you go back to the start of 1 Corinthians, Paul says one of the reasons he's writing this letter is because the Christians in Corinth feel like they're lacking something. And he writes to assure them they're not. He says, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, therefore you don't lack any spiritual gift as you eagerly wait for our Lord Jesus to be revealed. It's interesting. He links their sense that they are lacking to Jesus' return. This is what this has made me think this week. Whenever we feel like we're lacking in the Christian life, it's often because we're living like Jesus isn't alive. But he is. And whenever we feel like we're lacking in the Christian life, it's because we're living like he's not returning. But he is. And we don't need to live in the dark headspace of futility. You can live in the light of the hope of his firstfruits. Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. So I want to give you 3 quick applications to finish, and they are going to be quick, that Paul lands on in the final verses of what we read. I'm going to say something very quick about superstition, about suffering, and then about sin. Superstition. See in verse 29, I actually don't have a clue what's going on. It seems in the church in Corinth, there's people who have started this thing called baptisms from the dead. My best guess is it's some kind of superstitious practice. We don't know what's going on, but my guess is we can sympathize with why it's going on. In the face of death, we're all brought to our knees and we are left scrambling about for any crumb of comfort we can find. And often that ends up in some kind of superstitious thing to do or to say. That's where we end up, isn't it? So we either say things like, may they rest in peace, or they're soaring with the angels, or there's so many folk in our community who go and try and find someone who can do a seance. We cling to the superstitious. In reality, these things are trying to do exactly the same thing as getting hammered awake. They're trying to distract ourselves from the reality of death. What I want to show you is the resurrection of Jesus is not something superstitious. It was something that was actually witnessed. And I almost just want to invite you today to say, you can step out of the uncertainty of superstition onto the firm ground of Jesus' resurrection. And it can be a rock beneath your feet to stand on, even in the face of death. Don't settle for superstition. Find real hope in the resurrection of Jesus. Second thing, suffering. Paul knew what it was to suffer for belonging to Jesus. You can see that. Verses 30 to 32. He says, belonging to Jesus endangered him every day, and it made him face death every day. And Paul goes, what's the point of suffering for Jesus if Jesus didn't even rise from the dead? He said, what would you gain if that's the case? And he gets to the point and says, what's the point of endangering yourself? You might as well just concentrate on enjoying yourself. Eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow we die. But for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus means you can endure suffering for Jesus in this creation if you know for certain you are going to enjoy resurrectional life with Jesus in a new creation. Now, I don't know what belonging to Jesus means you've had to suffer. Maybe you've had to walk away from all the mates that you grew up with. Maybe your family have rejected you. Maybe standing up and speaking up for Jesus at work means that people think you are worthy of the loony bin. You need to remember the more fruits of Jesus' first fruits. If harm comes to you, you need to remember the harvest that is coming for you. And what you will gain then will outweigh anything you lose now. Final thing. Superstition, suffering, sinning. Paul makes this thing in his head where he goes, the resurrection of Jesus means you should be careful about both your thinking and your friendships. He says your company can corrupt your character. It's just true, isn't it? You surround yourself with people who just tell you that, Jesus hasn't risen from the dead, there's no more beyond this world. And if you surround yourself with voices that say, it doesn't matter if you're living like an enemy of Jesus, because nothing's going to happen to the enemies of Jesus. What's that going to lead to? You'll live however you want. But the resurrection reveals sin is senseless, because those living as Jesus' enemy now will be destroyed as Jesus' enemies then. And so the resurrection of Jesus makes Paul plead with these guys and say, please, don't be misled. Come to your senses and stop sinning. It makes me want to plead with you. and say, don't let the bad company in our community mislead you into death. But let the good news of Jesus lead you into this life-giving hope. You could come to Jesus today. You could come to your senses today. Come and find forgiveness today. Come and belong to Jesus today. Come and find and taste the first fruits today. And come and find this firm ground of hope that gives you life and destroys death.